Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Ori Goldberg. Ori is a former university professor with a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies. He has authored 4 books on revolutionary Iranian thought, and he has worked as a consultant on national security issues for the Israeli government. Today, he is an independent analyst appearing regularly on global media outlets. I welcome Ori Goldberg to Savage Minds. I came to know of you through Twitter. I've been reading your tweets on the situation in Gaza and Israel, and I was really impressed by your analysis. Now, as your bio states, you've worked as a consultant on national security issues for Israel.
Yeah.
You are an Israeli citizen.
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of work in Jerusalem and the West Bank. I was there in 2003. I lived in the Armenian quarters. And what struck me was the way that Israelis themselves reacted to Palestinians. And there were various situations that struck me just as a foreigner. I saw, for instance, some school children going through the old city, being escorted by a guard. And there was an old Palestinian man, he had to have been at least in his 70s, if not 80s, and he reached his hand out just to touch one of the kids' hands to say hello. And one of the guards got ready for a war. You know, the weapon was out. And I was there just walking. I was casually walking, and it just struck the corner of my eye. I saw many scenes where reactions to normal human relations seemed to have been almost militarized. And I'm talking about within Israel, not the West Bank yet. And this made me wonder about Israeli society and what Israelis are taught from birth about the Palestinian other, as it were. And I'm wondering if you might start off talking about the education of the Israeli child, both within the family and within educational and government structures, that might illuminate our listeners as to how Israelis are part of this very unfortunate situation that's ongoing now.
You've hit the nail on the head, because I think that may be the single most important factor in shaping Israeli political behavior and strategic behavior, and also its connection to morality on the individual and the public level. And the simplest answer I can give your question is that Israelis are simply taught nothing about the Palestinian. This sort of what you call militarization is, I think, probably even deeper and more primeval. It's a kind of a desensitization as to the very existence of Palestinians as human beings who share a basic equality with equality is the wrong word, because it isn't even apartheid. I mean, apartheid in South Africa was a policy meant to drive home the separation of the races on an unequal basis. And that inequality is, you imbibe it with the drinking water in Israel. It's not necessarily something you talk about. It's so profound, it's transparent even. You're not aware of it. If you ask most Israelis if Israel is a racist country, then they will say, of course it isn't. Our citizens, our Palestinian Israeli citizens, have every right that a Jewish citizen has, and they can live anywhere and do anything and be in parliament and whatever. And the people who are under occupation, well, we do that because it's a contingency. It's a necessity. We have to. We don't want to do that. But in all cases, the difference of the Palestinian, which affirms the Palestinians' humanity, it doesn't exist because Israelis know nothing about the Palestinians. They don't speak Arabic. They have no awareness of Palestinian history, because the very existence of such a history is considered a constant destabilizing threat to the all-pervasive nature of the Jewish Israeli narrative, which is the only narrative that can exist. I don't know if I'm making this point properly. It's not about fighting a war and emerging victorious. It's about a zero-sum game, basically. If they are acknowledged as full-fledged humans, then there's something wrong with us. Okay? There's something that undermines our right to live here. There's something that undermines our um, approach with regard to the world in the sense that, we are the perennial victims and we are owed, and this is the minimum that the world can do for us. And of course, we deserve what we have and we deserve impunity. If we allow the Palestinians entry into this equation, then we will undoubtedly every time come out worse for wear. So it's not about demeaning the Palestinians. It's not about, of course, I mean, of course, that enters into it, and it becomes about violence, and it becomes about segregation, and it becomes about murder and death ultimately. But initially, it's oblivion, it's nothing. And it's this basic desensitization. I mean, that you can't even say you encounter it. The sort of episode that you described is something that my children, I live in a suburb of Tel Aviv. My children could go a year, 2 years, without hearing Arabic spoken aloud in the street. Unless they make a particular effort, they will not see a shop sign in Arabic. They will certainly learn nothing in school about, the existence of Palestinians except as a threat. But the whole notion of a threat is second order. The first order, the basis, the roots of all this evil comes from nothingness, from a complete lack of awareness, conscious, because this is planned, this is carried out intentionally. But for most Israelis, they don't think about it because they don't even have the words to articulate it. It's just not there. And you'll notice how my sentences keep sounding circular because we're not taught to talk about it.
So in school, for instance, I'm going to guess that the word Nakba is not mentioned in history books,
Of course
or
it
it's
isn't.
framed as something else.
Of course it isn't. Now it's illegal. Now it's illegal. I mean, not the very word, but um, observing the memory of the Nakba on Israeli Independence Day, which is Nakba Day for the Palestinians, May 15th, is illegal. You can't do that because it's demeaning for Israeli Independence Day, which is an officially acknowledged and protected holiday. But in schools, of course not. And by the way, Israeli school children don't necessarily learn a great deal about 1948 either. When they study history, most of it is what is called Jewish history. That is not Israeli history. There are a lot of episodes in the history of the state of Israel that are not necessarily flattering, and of course, they're not taught in schools. But making the school subject, defining it as Jewish history, allows for an ahistorical continuity that transcends the specific events of 1948. It's not about disinheriting and expelling and killing the Palestinians. It's about Jews facing perennial persecution, always resisting it, with the Holocaust as a kind of a singularity, but also another link in a chain of Jews rising from the ashes and reestablishing themselves and reacquiring a sense of self. Of course, obviously, there's no mention of the Nakba or Palestinian narratives generally, which, by the way, if you'll permit me a slight digression, is part of what irritates the state of Israel so much about UNRWA, the United Nations refugee relief organization that has been working with Palestinians since the Nakba. Because UNRWA has become the keeper of Palestinian memory. UNRWA libraries, UNRWA archives, UNRWA documentation centers, they are the ones in Palestinian society, both within Palestine and in the Palestinian diaspora, in Jordan, in Lebanon, wherever you find Palestinian refugees, they are the ones who are charged with maintaining and expanding the networks of Palestinian collective memory. And that is a bee in Israel's bonnet because we don't want that memory to exist.
Are you taught in school about the origins at all of Israeli statehood, beginning with Lahi and Irgun?
Yes, but mostly it's presented as a case of in-house squabbles, of domestic disagreements. Of course, there was a right, and of course, there was a left, and of course, there was a center. It's part of becoming a quote unquote normal people. Okay. And also, Jews have always had their differences. It's well known that you get three opinions from two Jews, from every two Jews. Pick two Jews on the street at random, ask them for their opinions, you get three opinions. So that's how it's presented, not certainly not as terrorism. I mean, even if you talk about something like uh, the terrorist attack on the King David Hotel, it would be stressed very powerfully that there was a warning given and that
Mhm.
civilians were not usually killed and attacks were attacks on the British Army and that it was, again, an existential struggle for the Jews. So even if Lehi and Irgun, or as we call it, Etzel, which is an acronym for a national military organization, even if they were fascist sympathizers at some point, what matters most is that they were a part of the national struggle.
And do you learn at all about like Haganah's violence towards the British, or is that wiped out too?
Well, we learn about it again, not so much. It's not, I think, it's not a mandatory part of matriculating in history. I mean, it's an a Jewish history matriculation exam at the end of 12 grades of school is compulsory, but it doesn't usually cover 1948 or and the years preceding it. And also, if we learn about the violence, then of course it's a legitimate violence. It's a war of liberation, and we are simply coming into our own because this was our country long before the British even existed. So, what are you talking about?
Right. The reason why I'm heading towards these groups is, of course, the way in which Hamas is portrayed. Suddenly, there's a shift in the history of Israel. These groups are normalized as part of resistance against colonization. But paradoxically, colonization that has been acted by the state of Israel is presented quite differently. Now, I hear an American accent when you speak, a very American accent when you speak. So, have you spent time living in North America?
I spent about 3 years in North America as a boy, and I was fortunate. I had American friends with whom I could speak when I returned to Israel. And I've been speaking a lot of English over the past 2 years, but generally throughout my academic career, I've been fortunate. And I have a facility for language, but like all people who are good with languages, I'm basically an impersonator. So put me in a room with a group of Irishmen, and I'll have, a nice little brogue after 2 weeks. But my default accent is American. When I traveled in the United States as a young man, it was amusing. I went there with my then girlfriend, now ex-wife, and we traveled all over the United States for about 2 months. And everybody everywhere was sure I was American, just not from their part of the country. In the West, they thought I was from New York. In New York, they thought I was from the Midwest. I have a generic American accent.
Yes, you do, in fact. My coming to terms, or my knowledge of Israel and the Palestine question, I'll paradoxically put it that way, was when I was at New York University as a graduate student, and
Mm-hmm.
NYU's Tisch department had these weekend film screenings, which I attended religiously. There was a man there, one of the first weekends I went, and he presented himself to me. We said hi, we had coffee in the hallway. And I learned he had just been released from prison in Israel. And I'm thinking, okay, he's here. It was very odd. I was 20 years old, I believe, at the time. And he was telling me how he had spent a year in an Israeli prison. And I said, may I ask what you were in prison for? I was a bit curious. And he said, I was given no trial. They arrested me because I was Palestinian. That was my intro 101 to your country. And I was both in disbelief and shock. Of course, Americans and Canadians were always in shock about the aporia of true factual information on the media, which is what happened to me back in 2003. I was on my way to Israel. I attended 2 conferences in Cyprus, one in Nicosia, the other in Famagusta, between which was a 3-week break. So I spent a lot of time in the northern part of the island, in the Turkish part. And while I was at the first conference, I came across a couple. They were Israelis who had left Israel as conscientious objectors living in London. Chaim Breshith, you might know Chaim, and his wife Yosefa. And they started to sort of forewarn me about what I was about to experience. I was in my 30s and I thought I had read everything. I had a research proposal that was funded, a travel grant. I was on my way to do some work. I was doing a project that ended up being part of a book project on the first 5 female suicide bombers of the Second Intifada. I thought I was ready. And Ori, I was in shock. It wasn't just the 4 or 5 hour inquisition at the airport where the guy is pointing to a photocopy he had made a few days before of Richard Gere's passport, saying he was just here. They were asking me what I was doing for 3 weeks in Cyprus. Well, it was a month, actually, what I was doing there. And did you know our last suicide bomber attack, they trained in Cyprus? I also had my hair in an unfortunate Pippi Longstocking style, so it was really funny. And I was telling this gentleman, there were 2 at the time, I said, I'm very sorry that happened, but I can assure you I was not trained to do anything in Cyprus. I was preparing for my research. I was doing auto study of Turkish. What a great language. Anyways, finally got out, went to Tel Aviv. I was very late to get into the hotel. By the time the next day, got to Jerusalem, settled, I had seen so many things, just the registry of all the things I saw. And I was raised first in Canada, but from the age of 10 in the deep South. I've seen all sorts of crazy racism, especially when we lived in Mississippi, especially there. And it was still nothing in comparison to what I saw in Israel, really.
Yeah.
I wasn't in Mississippi in the 50s. I was in Mississippi in the early 80s, through the mid 80s. And so nothing really prepared me for this, but I just remember after my first checkpoint, oh my God, I just looked at my then girlfriend and I said, we've been lied to. We, meaning Americans, she was an American, but our media does not cover any of what we've just lived through the last 15 hours. None of it. And that was a real red light to the indoctrination that goes on throughout media, government, even our educational system, because goodness knows, why are we not taught better about this? Because when I was about 10, I might have been a little older, I might have been 12, the Anwar Sadat, Menachem Begin peace process kicked off, and we're taught, this nice Anwar Sadat, look at him in his suit and tie, and they're signing the paper, but it was pretty much devoid of the actual history, the violence, and of course, the delegitimization of Palestinian rights, statehood, you name it. I am going to kick over to something you wrote yesterday on X. You've written this. I've written this here over the past few weeks, and it grows daily. Israel is as weak as it has ever been. While Germany and a few other countries announce deals for Israeli weapons, Israel has only the conditional support of the Trump administration. Israel does not control reality on the ground, despite the killing and the prevention of aid. And then you go on to say Gaza has been internationalized. Israelis have happily stopped caring and have retreated inside the walls of the asylum, mounting productions for their own benefit. The military dictatorship in the West Bank is also imploding, with settlers taking over and the only law being murderous violence. Israeli oppression is no longer sustainable as a status quo. Israel must make a decision, go for full overt dictatorship, or accept an imposed settlement. You go on, but I'm going to end there because I was really like, wow, this is such a great analysis of what's happening. Can you continue your analysis? Because I asked you initially about how Israelis are educated from childhood about these, let's call them distant, not so distant neighbors. I also know that when I was living in Jerusalem, it was just appalling to me how many people had no clue what was happening as close as Ramallah, right? They had no clue about the time it took to travel. Like I would go to the wall every Friday and I'd be at dinner with people and they'd ask me what I did that day. And I would say, well, I just came from Hebron. They had no idea that that trip I took from Hebron would not have been the same trip that they had taken from Hebron, which would be a matter of so many minutes, which for me was a matter of so many hours. Can you talk about this kind of managerialization that's happening both within society and the media and how this is playing out now? Because your tweet yesterday is quite shocking because it's also true. We're seeing an implosion. It's been going on even during the last 2 years. Offenses in the West Bank have been less reported on, but settlers have been going ballistic over Palestinians living nearby.
I think to try and analyze this, really, I think I want to repeat what I said when we started talking about the importance of recognizing nothingness as a key part of the way, or perhaps the key part of the way Israelis understand the existence of Palestinians. How not just ignorant, but how it's about, it's not even an act of reducing them to nothing. Nothingness is where you start from. And that's the initial axiom. The Palestinians are not people. And that takes on many manifestations. October 7th, 2023 was a case in point. You know, the scales fell from our collective eyes here in Israel because we'd been politely talking the peace talk for a long time. And nothing came out of it. And then the Hamas attack took place, and it was horrific. It was traumatic. It was horrible. Hundreds and hundreds of civilians were killed. And as far as Israelis were concerned, what the Hamas attack showed was that we'd been right all along. That the Palestinians really are not worth our time. And it's hard to think about it in those terms, and I get that a lot in my Twitter activity. I communicate with a lot of people who really find it difficult, and found it even more difficult about a year and a half ago when I started writing that Israel is not operating on the basis of some kind of master plan, a kind of an ultimate vision that is going to be realized. Israel is day by day working towards that vision, but that Israelis are operating from that place of nothingness, of that complete desensitization. There's a lot of people, I think the great majority of people living outside Israel who've not been reared on this nothingness that I'm talking about. They are absolutely convinced that there has to be a plan, that a genocide is driven by a rational desire. Okay, and you look at Nazi Germany, there was a rational desire. It was about exterminating the Jews because they were, and the Roma and homosexuals and other minorities, but mostly the Jews, because they were a threat to the world, because their existence threatened the entire world. So the plan, the acknowledgement of the threat was rational, and the plan of action was a rational one. We will set up camps. We will round up all the Jews. We will kill them and develop scientific methods to kill them. That's not what's happening here. The great majority of Palestinians who have died throughout these 2 years of violent genocide have been, and Israel will be the first to admit this, bystanders. Collateral damage, as they're called here. And even the most far-fetched numbers that Israel releases about the how many Hamas personnel it has killed, and none of those numbers are believable. They talk about, I don't know, 20,000 Hamas operatives at most, but Israel has never suggested that the numbers released from Gaza are untrue. In fact, Israel has always, in all of its Gaza wars, accepted the casualty numbers provided by what's referred to as the Hamas Health Ministry. And even there, we're talking about, at the very least, a 3-to-1 ratio. But as the numbers come out, it's more like a 15-to-1 ratio as far as civilians are concerned. So it's all about that. It's all about that nothingness. It starts from there, from the fact that these deaths don't even register. Only if they're like a hoax, if Hamas is trying to perpetrate a huge hoax and claim that Israel is starving the population, where it's very clear that I just saw this a video clip from about 6 months ago where a member of Knesset, not from of our parliament, not from an extreme right-wing party, says that at a parliamentary committee meeting that the only health risk facing Gazans is obesity. Okay, that's not how you talk about a people you actively, consciously want to vanquish. It's how you talk about a people whose existence seems like a fantasy to you to begin with. And that's why Israel's weakness is not registering. That's the difficulty, I think, for strategic analysts and for the general lay reader both, because you see Israel kill constantly, and you see Israel attack at will. And you say to yourself, a country that can do that is a country that is free to go about realizing its well-laid rational plans. It doesn't matter what's happening to Israel. Israel has the resolve and the weapons and the backing and the funding to continue to do what it has always wanted to do, which is kill all the Palestinians and take all the land. But I think that that's not the main thing that's driving Israel. The main thing that's driving Israel is really, at this point, a kind of a fantasy that just wants the Palestinians to be gone, wants this problem to be over with and done. And the fact that Israel can kill Palestinians ultimately means very little. Of course, it means a great deal in terms of loss of life and the unconscionable evil that is being perpetrated on a daily basis. But in strategic terms, it means very little. Israel is only capable of doing what it has been doing for the past 2 years, and that capability is growing lesser and weaker by the day, because Israel's true weakness lies in the fact that the Israeli agenda, the Israeli priority list, which initially was simply accepted because that was the way of the world. Israel is right, everybody else is wrong. That's what Israel's friends in DC, in North America, in Europe, that's what they thought, and that's how they acted. If the Israelis are saying this, especially after the Hamas attack, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing about how Israel is holding the fort and fighting the great good fight for Judeo-Christian civilization against the Muslim hordes. That was also a major part of it. But even more basic than that was the sense that, of course, Israel knows it's such a complex thing, and Israelis, they're good people, and they're living in that horrible neighborhood. So let them do what they need to do and just get on with it. That is no longer the case. And it isn't that it's no longer the case because the world has discovered goodness and morality. The world still doesn't care about the Palestinians. The world's still profoundly racist, interest-driven hellhole. But Israel has been so consistent in flouting every convention, in caring only for its own interests, and not stopping to listen even to members of the Trump administration, who are no doubt extremely sympathetic to the Israeli cause for a broad variety of reasons. Israel just doesn't stop, and people have had enough. Think about it think about being at a party, and recognizing somebody who used to be your friend and is now ridiculously drunk uh, and spouting off all kinds of secrets and racist bullshit. And what you do when you meet somebody like that, uh, who's your friend, you don't just tell him off because he's your friend. You walk away. You start taking baby steps backwards. You want to remove yourself from the vicinity. And in many ways, that's what's being done to Israel. Not in many ways, that's what's being done to Israel. Israel is being pushed out of Gaza. Now, that seems ridiculous to say with the IDF controlling more than 50% of the strip. But Gaza Strip is the face of the moon at the moment. Control of the Gaza Strip doesn't really mean anything. Israel has demolished it as part of the genocide it has carried out there. So the fact that the IDF garrisons are spread all over this imaginary yellow line, it doesn't mean anything for the future as nearby as tomorrow. You know, um, and and that's just growing stronger. The U.S., the Trump administration is coming here en masse, not to express support for Israel like Biden did after October 7th, 2023, but to make damn sure that both the Israeli public and the Israeli prime minister know who's calling the shots. And that is the United States. It's not Israel. There's a United States military HQ at the heart of Israel, Turkey, who has been Israel's greatest regional rival over the past 2 years, is going to establish a logistical headquarters in Israel, and Israel is going to accept Turkish presence, and Israel is just being forced to swallow all kinds of things that it would never have done at any time it has existed. I'm going to be 50 in November. I have never seen Israel being brought so low in terms of having to accept things that it itself had defined as extremely detrimental to its security. Now, there's a contradiction here which is hard to stomach because it seems crass and superficial to approach the Israeli genocide and say, you don't understand, Israel's getting weaker. As Israel continues to kill innocent Palestinians, that's a bad word, Palestinians who keep crossing the imaginary yellow line and blame their deaths on a violation of the ceasefire, or claim that they were threatening the military forces there. Two civilians, one of them a veterinary physician who went to check on his clinic and the animals he had been forced to leave there when he evacuated, against platoons and battalions and brigades of soldiers all armed to the teeth, and they were a threat and had to be killed. It's hard to look at that and say to people, look, Israel's getting weaker. You have to understand that this is a longer term process, and forget about that. What's important is the strategic truth. You don't want to forget about that. You want the injustice, you want the evil to ring as loud as they can possibly ring. You never want to forget that. But Israel is also simultaneously losing control of its state institutions, watching its economy and infrastructures crumble, watching prices rise hysterically as wages remain at best stagnant and often decrease because employers have no money. And generally being as close to being a failed state as I can recall ever. These two situations exist simultaneously. And I would even go out further on a limb and say that this strategic implosion is the one that ultimately will shape Israeli response and Israeli willingness to accept superimposed solutions, not Israeli feelings, not Israeli fantasies, not Israeli desires, whatever. All of it is going to be shaped by necessities that Israel encounters and by the fact that I find very promising that just about everybody around the world simply doesn't care anymore what Israelis feel and about their sense of safety and about their sense of victimhood and how what was done on October 7th is the worst massacre perpetrated on the Jews since the Holocaust, and so on and so forth. People just don't care, and Israel can only blame itself for that, which makes me more and more cautiously optimistic each day.
This is not the final solution. And
Mm.
I think with all of the anger directed towards Israel, not just these past 2+ years, but for many decades about what some people have had a bird's eye view on witnessing, even though it was obfuscated in much of Western media, the occupation, the apartheid. I think that there becomes a moment when we start to look at the horizon of everyone who's giving their 2 cents, what people think in this kind of area studies, in academia, in journalism, left, right, talk show hosts. And I've even seen the evolution over the past 2 years of certain media outlets that were very reticent to discussing anything that Israel did that was slightly wrong, to now at least admitting forced starvation. What you said about obesity being mentioned is something that I've come across. There were many feminists over the past month who've been talking about how Palestinians don't need food, they need a treadmill, echoing the
Mm-hmm.
comment that you referred to earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this speaks to propaganda. There is no final solution. What we're seeing is desperation of people making the most absurdist claims. You've seen the comment of, I had this yesterday sent to the umpteenth time to me on Twitter. What kind of genocide is it where people are increasing in population? And they sent a population graph.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'm afraid to tell you population growth has nothing to do with the definition of genocide, but leave that as it may. And we know the racist tropes around certain communities that have, quote unquote, too many children. And these are the kind of racist comments that historically have driven other types of narratives as well. Since the Manchester synagogue attack the other week, I'm seeing that people are reading things in a teleological way. So now anti-Semitism is the cause of October 7th. Anti-Semitism is the cause of Hamas. Anti-Semitism is the cause of anyone who supports Palestinian resistance, Palestinian independence and liberation. It's anti-Semitism. Okay, that's the cat ate my homework. But in reality, I think there's something else going on here. The synagogue attack, had it not been a synagogue attack, had it just been an attack on a post office, as so frequently happens in my country, we would have thought, wacko gunman, wacko person with a knife, wacko man. But what's going on, I fear, is that the Hasbara, together with the Zionist ideology that has for decades propagated the notion that Jewishness is to Zionism what Zionism is to Jewishness, completely eviscerating the whole political discourse that undergirds it, has been successful in a very negative way. This has become a self-fulfilling prophecy that now people will say, oh, that guy with the knife in Manchester was an anti-Semite. But what if all resistance to, and I'm not claiming he was resisting it, because he could have been just a mentally unhealthy person. We already know certain roots he had to Syria and even affinities he had to Israel, ironically. Leave that as it may, there's a lot of rage towards the state of Israel that is now, of course, being laundered as anti-Semitism. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy of Zionism, such that the subject can never make an articulation against the project of an apartheid state, cannot make a criticism of the Israeli project of its oppression of Palestinians, because that is part and parcel of anti-Semitism. Hence, the redefinition of what anti-Semitism is that's been pushed upon universities across England, Australia, Canada, the US. So now, if we conceive of anti-Semitism as a project that is also about criticizing Israel, thusly, we can never criticize Israel, right?
Absolutely, and I'll make one or two analogies to situations I think we've all encountered in our own lives. Um, Self-fulfilling prophecies are a mark of existential despair. at the individual level just as much as they are at the collective level. I think we've all either been there ourselves or know somebody who demonstrated that to us. If you are sinking, then you will adjust your energy and your goals and your self-perception and your positioning in reality to that sinking feeling. And ultimately, you will accomplish what you set out to do, which is to sink. And in many ways, our demise, not the end of Israel as a state, but our utter and complete failure. In that sense, I agree with you regarding Zionism. Our utter and complete failure is also our ultimate proof of life, because everything that Zionism demands, everything that the state of Israel has come to demand, comes from being a victim. And so the ultimate victimhood is also the ultimate legitimization. So that's certainly true, and I think that's discernible in just about every aspect of Israeli life today. But another element of the circle that you're talking about, that's both, it both limits us, but also makes us eternal. Because if we can make that circle as full as we possibly could, if we could, how should I put it? If we can make our argument completely circular, if we can be safely ensconced within that circle, then we will both win the day, because then we will have proven that the Palestinians had no right to exist, to begin with. The Palestinians simply weren't there. We were the only ones who were there. So that would be a win. And it would also be the best protection, the best insulation. We would reject not just the Palestinians, we would reject, as we are doing now, we would reject everybody. We would not fully acknowledge the existence of anyone but ourselves. And as far as we're concerned, that's the jackpot. That's really the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, if you will, because if we get to that stage, we no longer need to justify our own existence. We no longer need to prove to anyone that we're normal. We no longer need to prove anything to anyone. It's just us. I think about that as solipsism, the philosophical position that basically says that the person who's holding it is the only real being that exists in the universe, that everything else is a production mounted for their own behalf. And I think that the main reason we are so angry, we were so angry after October 7th, 2023, was that our solipsistic fantasy had been shattered. We thought we were on the verge of making this whole Palestinian thing go away. We would normalize relations with the Saudis. We would make our occupation of the Palestinian territories just a fact of life, and we would make the world forget about the problem here. We would make the world acknowledge that this was the way things simply are. That's the Palestinians' true place. And then the Hamas attack occurred, and it was horrific, and it was horrific and traumatic and all of those things. But it also shattered any attempt we might have had at continuing to delude ourselves. The Palestinians weren't going to go anywhere. They weren't going to acknowledge their place. They weren't going to fulfill our fantasy. They were here.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. I hope I'm not being offensive in saying this, but I work a lot as an anthropologist, and I'm very much an admirer of the work of Victor Turner on performativity, but I think that Israel is producing its own theater of anti-Semitism to its own benefit, or trying to harness this. So we can talk about any kind of enunciation or attack as being anti-Semitic, even if those manifestations, those protests outside of X embassy or in X city were not about the state and its repression, but were really about hating us. It's very easy to win the argument if everything is about me, right? Then it's about feelings. And it's interesting because I've noticed over the past 20 years, I've been doing a lot of work on identity movements. And these identity movements get a lot of their political traction from hurt feelings and from saying, well, you're trying to kill us. You deny my existence. What you are doing is anti-democratic, even if someone is saying, sorry, lesbians don't have penises. So you have these discourses that I've witnessed happening between various groups of people. And the argument that is winning the day over the past 2 decades has not been reason or facts. It's been emotion. So we've had loads of laws brought in on the basis of emotion, not on reality. And when you were speaking earlier, I kept thinking about this. The desire to control the narrative is what Israel is up against. It's not Hamas. It's how they can frame it.
Yeah. At this stage, that's certainly true.
I've noticed also yesterday, I think it was yesterday, you retweeted an article about Israel's trying to push the free speech in the UK, that this is also, there's a whole narrative of control of what others can say about Israel outside of Israel's borders.
Yep.
Can you speak about that? Because this is something that is quite astounding, especially since Trump in the US went in on a mandate of free speech and he's against lawfare. I was totally appalled by what was going on against him because we all know that Clinton did 10 times worse, but let's not talk about facts there either. That infamous mugshot of his. And I thought, great, at least, I mean, he's going to do a lot of damage. I'm very far to the left. I was under no illusion about Trump, but I thought at least the free speech issue might be solved. And the buzzer goes off. Can you talk about this?
Sure. I'll just start by saying that, what you just said about the way you began your remarks now about Israel performing these productions for its own benefit. That was what I tried to refer to in the tweet you so graciously read before, to the whole notion of that was raised in the play by Peter Weiss in Marat Sade, which is fully entitled "The Persecution and Assassination of Jean-Paul Marat as Performed by the Inmates of the Asylum of Charenton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade." It's about a play within a play where the Marquis de Sade, who is mentally ill, directs his fellow inmates, reenacting the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, the politician. And that was the point. I mean, Israelis have retreated inside the asylum, and the whole world is the asylum. Okay, but as far as we're concerned, we're inside. We don't have to abide by any kind of rules anymore. Anything that mentions us is either in our praise or a direct attack on us, and we are able and should be able to reply, retort, rebuff, and it doesn't matter where or when or by whom. Freedom of speech, that's great, but what use is freedom of speech if it commits the ultimate moral wrong of attacking Israel? There's nothing more important. There's nothing more morally justified than our existence. Our existence as we determine it. And anything that not just critiques us, but anything that doesn't acknowledge our right to define our world the way we see fit is an existential threat to us. So you've got that ridiculous episode in the UK with the West Midlands police forbidding Israeli football fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv, an Israeli football club, from entering a game they'll be playing with the English side, Aston Villa. Now, Maccabi Tel Aviv fans have a history of hate chants and violent rampages in the cities that host them. And Birmingham and its members of parliament uh, signed a petition. 3,000 people signed a petition asking that these fans not be allowed into Birmingham for reasons of safety. West Midlands Police contacted a professional uh, consultation group called the Safety Advisory Board or whatever, and they determined that the entrance of these fans to the football pitch would be a major security risk. So they banned these fans. The United Kingdom went crazy. You know, we established this country so Jews won't be banned from whatever. And this is the first time Jews have been banned in Britain, and Jews must be protected, and it's the rights of Jews. And of course, this stoked the flames, and everybody in Israel talked about the anti Semitism of the British authorities, even though the UK has been a great friend to Israel over these past 2 years. But again, the important thing to understand is that we don't abide by any kind of abstract rule or principle. The only principle we have is our continued existence. And if in order to ensure that, we have to retreat inside the walls of the asylum, if only so we can have final cut, we can have the ultimate artistic discretion in mounting and directing the productions we mount for our own benefit, that so be it. We don't care. Now, of course, we care. We depend on our trade with the world. We depend on the goodwill of the world. We depend on American aid. We depend on the association agreement with the EU. But at least rhetorically, and as far as most Israelis are concerned, you know, if that's what we have to do, then that's what we have to do. And none of these rules, none of these principles are any practical good if they can be used to do anything but affirm our absolute right to do whatever the hell we decide we want to do. And you are absolutely right when you look at it, and it isn't just offensive. It's not just, you know, espousing hard right anti-democratic opinions. It's crazy. It really is crazy. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about taking a sharp swerve from, you know, reality. And again, that's also hard to articulate because you immediately get dragged into the whole is it okay or isn't it okay? Yeah, for months when I was doing interviews, I had my activities on Twitter brought me some media attention, and I did interviews in, I don't know, dozens of countries. And for months, they kept asking me one question, which was, what does Israel want? And I kept saying, we don't know what we want, you know, and we make an effort not to know what we want. If we knew what we wanted, we'd be constrained. And that they found that all of my interlocutors found that mind-boggling. Rightfully so, because who doesn't know what they want? How can you have an intelligent conversation with somebody like that? And the answer is that you can't. We're past that stage. You should no longer take Israeli opinions and views and feelings into consideration. We've lost that privilege. We've insisted for so long that our way of doing things, which ultimately amounts to a rejection of not just conventional wisdom, but reality, is the only way, that we should not be given the courtesy of, you know, assuming that we're actually in it for the realpolitik of it. We're not. And that's also difficult because when you say Israel is insane, then it sounds like you're playing for compassion. You know, what are you going to do? We're crazy. I mean, people who are crazy are not tried for criminal offenses because you can't actually prove intent in a crazy person, right? So we're not. it's not the craziness as much as it's a rejection of everything but ourselves. And that's not insanity. That's a disease. And it does really threaten humanity if humanity chooses to accept it. Unless the world just simply breaks up, which I don't know that it can do anymore. So yeah, really, really, really difficult to articulate, really difficult to um, drive home political points here because it's not so much about right versus left or evil versus goodness. It's about nothingness and rejection and all of that.
When I look at polls about support for what Israel is doing, despite the United States having the First Amendment, conversely, despite the states having organizations like AIPAC, which are ideological machinery implanted adjacent to the government, let's say, even though they are also in the government, if you start to look at how they bankroll our politicians. In recent weeks, I started to look at the polls between the UK and the US. There is a surprisingly, alarmingly high support of Israel in the UK. And I wonder, what's that about? I have hypothesized historical guilt over Balfour, historical guilt over decades of tacit support. I haven't figured it out. I don't know if anyone will figure it out. I'm wondering if you have thought about this, because in the US, it's easier for me to analyze, not because I'm an American only. Yeah, I have friends who tell me about their upbringing, if they went to yeshiva or if they went to Hebrew school or what that looked like. I have friends who come from very secular families, but still did the symbolic rituals to please the grandparents, on and on. However, I am alarmed by people who consider themselves leftist in the UK. They're really neoliberals when push comes to shove. Guardian, Independent, New Statesman readers, all these people who believe themselves to be on the left side of the center are overtly supporting the genocide. The feminists, that's just a crazy story because I've been dealing with that even on the show, looking at the misinformation, the fact that they love parroting disinformation about the alleged rapes and babies in ovens, beheadings, etc., etc. I don't even know if that'll ever stop. Because back to what we were speaking about before, the victim narrative is the gift that keeps on giving. I'd say there's a whole socio-psychological aspect that could be examined at a later stage about what's going on. But I wanted to know, Ori, if you've given thought to why people who are self-described leftists, at least very liberal in the UK, would be supporting this genocide, because I cannot figure it out.
I guess I can give two, uh, precursory explanations for that. None of them are necessarily knowledgeable or deep enough to hold. One would be that this sits in very well with, or this allows people to express emotion on issues that they feel themselves forbidden from uh, considering or talking about out loud that regard their own lives. Deep-seated racism, real fear of what would happen if we were to give an inch to these barbarian hordes. And I think in the UK, in many ways, the sense of uh, a constant threat to quote unquote our way of life is maybe the most intense out of pretty much all the European countries I know. I mean, even in a place like France, where there's massive immigration, but there's also, the Republic, which is still stable, and the whole notion of laïcité, which is not really translatable, but let's call it secularity, that is part and parcel of being a citizen of the state. Even in Germany, with the German chancellor constantly threatening to go off the rails, I don't know if you had a chance to see his recent racist rant about how there has to be a change in immigration policy, and if you don't understand why, ask your daughters if you have any. Um, the, yeah. Then again, there's a sense of a functional state. I think in the UK, the sense that the political system is broken, and that nobody can provide the relief and leadership and the vision that the country needs is also um, is indeed very, very powerful in the sense that you can enlist in the good fight and fight it and be able to express what you want in a framework that is still acceptable. Whereas if you were to hang uh, 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 an English flag, the cross of St. George, on your balcony, then you would be denounced as a racist by your would-be liberal neighbors. I think a lot of people take up that cause by proxy, not necessarily because they're such great supporters of Israel or because they are, dyed in the wool Zionists or whatever. And the second explanation would be that, you know what? I don't know if the second explanation holds water, if it's reasonable at all, because it has to do with Israeli influence in the UK, and it has to do with the way Jewish organizations in the UK are structured. By the way, I think in Australia, there's also a lot of support for the Israeli cause because of the strength and highly conservative nature of Australian Jewish organizations. And there's the sense that um, the Jewish organizations are perhaps one of the few remaining entities that respect and appreciate both British and English nationalism, if you will, national identities as they once were, because they were such great beneficiaries of these systems and because they adopted them wholeheartedly. And there's nobody who is as zealous as a convert. Uh, so so the Jews are proof positive that you can actually be British or English, that you can be Australian. And I think a lot of Jews uh, project their belief in their own national identity onto what's happening in Israel, and this circling of the wagons that they experience from their contacts with Israeli public consciousness. Now that projection has absolutely no foundations in reality. The situation is very different, but I would suspect that's a part of it as well.
Many people outside of Israel are asking, well, what about the protests against the genocide in Gaza? There have been
Hmm.
some. My question is, how are the refuseniks, for instance, framed? I interviewed many of them back in 2003, but there are many more. Also, the stories they bring back, not only to their families, but their communities, because they are refusing to serve in the occupied territories based on their moral revulsion as to what they either saw or experienced or heard about, and they wanted nothing to do with this. Could you speak a bit about that and how Israelis react to criticism from their own?
Sure. There's less and less of it. Um, Fewer and fewer refuseniks I mean, really, I mean, you could count them. I think you can count them on the fingers of, two hands. People who are officially refusing, or people who went fought in Gaza and later withdrew themselves from the reserves. There are a lot of people who are doing it in an unofficial capacity without announcing what they're doing, but they're not doing it because they object to the genocide. Most of them, they're doing it because their lives are crumbling. Their families are disintegrating, their businesses are going under. So that's why a lot of them do it. As far as intellectual and political criticism from within goes, I'll just tell you that personally, I receive very few threats, very few threats, but also relatively little hate mail because I'm not even considered a potential mm, negative influence. I'm just considered insane. Uh, the circling of the wagons is so tight uh, that people who intentionally position themselves outside this circle, they're not worth anyone's time. There's nothing to say to them. If I were to express my opinions, people would perhaps become irate for a few minutes, but would then lose interest because there's no use in talking to me. Because I am not, the things that I say, they just don't register. Israelis are not, or very few of them are capable of listening, and certainly of hearing and internalizing. Now, there are, I would say, people who share my convictions and who protest against the genocide specifically, and are the same people who protested against the occupation. And they were always a part of the anti-Netanyahu protests, but they were a vilified part. The great majority of the people who protested against Netanyahu did not approve of um, hardcore left-wing protesters being there because they wanted their protests against Netanyahu to be perceived as apolitical. We're protesting against Netanyahu because he's the worst, and he's mad and corrupt, and he's hijacked the country. If we could only get rid of him and regain control of our country, then everything would revert back to normal. But of course, normal means, a full-fledged, constantly expanding occupation and the crawling annexation of the West Bank and a blockade of Gaza and everything that has been going on in Israel for the past, depending on who you ask, the past 80 or 60 years. So the great majority of Israelis who were protesting against Netanyahu, were protesting against his mismanagement of the war, against his mistakes on October 7th, against his refusal to return the hostages, which was seen as protesting for Israeli solidarity, for Israel as it truly is, an Israel who prefers the well-being of its individual citizens to the realization of any kind of strategic agenda, certainly what these liberal Israelis are now calling the messianic agenda, which is one of settlements and so on in the name of the divine redemption. But the really sobering truth of the matter is that these people were only affirming and validating Netanyahu's policy, his genocidal activities, the Israeli government's genocidal activities in Gaza, because they never opposed the genocide. The great majority of Israelis, the great majority of Israeli Jews, don't oppose the genocide. They don't necessarily celebrate it, but they enable it, facilitate it, allow it, and at their very worst, simply deny it and ignore it. But they don't object to it. They don't denounce it. They don't claim any responsibility for it. Netanyahu's potential heirs all say the same thing. Now they're accusing him with the situation on the ground gradually, quickly being taken away from Israeli hands. What his would-be opposition is saying is, you are so weak, you couldn't even destroy Hamas. What that means effectively is we still think that destroying Hamas is one of our war goals. And once all the hostages are back home, including the dead ones, nothing should stop us from returning to Gaza and making sure that Hamas is destroyed. Now, Hamas will never be destroyed. How can you decide when Hamas is destroyed? When you've physically killed anyone who worked for Hamas, when you've killed all of their security personnel, when you've assassinated all the journalists and physicians that you blame, who you blame as Hamas, for being Hamas operatives. It's a political decision. Any declaration that Hamas is destroyed is the same as President George W. Bush's mission accomplished moment in Iraq. But what it effectively means is that most Israelis ultimately would not object to renewing the genocide once the hostages are back home. And all of these protests, I mean, I'll just anecdotally talk about for a second the biggest one yet, which was right before the deal was signed and the living hostages were released. It was a big one in Tel Aviv, and both Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner spoke at it. And when I think Witkoff mentioned Netanyahu and the sacrifices that he made, the 100 or 120,000 people who were in the protest booed. Israeli social media went wild. For a week, they discussed whether they should have booed or they shouldn't have booed, whether it was appropriate or a show of disrespect, whether a healthy nation boos its prime minister because of a domestic squabble, or whether this is democracy at its finest. And all the while, as they were debating this, nobody noticed that they were only talking about Netanyahu. Netanyahu was the only person on their mind. So even those who would never in a million years tell you that they affirmed or supported any of Netanyahu's policies were in actuality saying he's the only one who is a point of reference. He's the only one who does anything. Okay, which is why when an election is called in Israel, and one will likely be called during the first half of 2026, when Netanyahu puts himself up for election again, unless, of course, he is convicted by then, which is highly doubtful, there's a very good chance that he will emerge from those elections as leader of the biggest party and will be given the mandate of forming a government and will end up as prime minister of Israel again. Because a lot of these Israelis who protested against him, when the hostages are back home, when the military is doing what the military does, when they are at the ballot and they, have only themselves to persuade, they're going to look around at the field of potential competitors, and they're going to see a group of elderly ex-generals or career politicians who have never disagreed with Netanyahu about anything. So they will say to themselves, why vote for the pale epigons when I can vote for the original? And they'll vote for Netanyahu.
The Holocaust comes up regularly when discussing what has happened to the Palestinians. And I mean, even in a negative sense, such as Israelis saying you cannot make that comparison. Reminds me of the 1980s in New York City. There was a raging debate with Al Sharpton and Louis Farrakhan calling slavery the African-American Holocaust. And you had a huge debate about that. I keep thinking about Theodor Adorno's infamous words about how there can be no poetry after Auschwitz. Like all of us, I think we're all human. No matter what our background is, Jewish or not, we grow up and we hear about what happened during World War II. And as a child, I was horrified. It's like a kid. How can people, how, it's like my daughter asking me, why are people not stopping what's happening in Gaza? She sees me working on this subject, put on Al Jazeera and other media regularly. I'm left in this position of wondering, how are Israelis going to deal with this in future years and generations? Their identity has largely been steeped, and I'm painting with a broad brush here. Israelis' identity has been steeped in this resuscitation of life from the gas chambers, from the horrors of what happened in Germany and Poland. And there is definitely injustice in that history. Nobody who is sane would disagree. However, it's also a paradox and a truism at the same time. What many, I'm thinking of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, who warns about in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, what happens when the oppressed become the oppressors. And I don't think Israelis are able to take this on, at least not in an intellectually honest way. So on Twitter, the last place you want to go to have a discussion with anyone in good faith, because Twitter is the capital of bad faith discussions. How can we couch this? Or maybe the better question is, what is the future of the coming generation of Israelis who I did see at a protest. They were very young, many of them teens, early 20s, who were protesting the genocide in Gaza. This was about 2.5, 3 weeks ago. What is their legacy? And what do you think will come of this?
Hmm. Mm, good question. Um, I don't know about the famous, I mean, I know, of course, of the famous no poetry after Auschwitz quote. Uh, I don't know about poetry here, although I think Israeli Hebrew creativity has taken a real blow um, because of what's been happening over the past 2 years. I do know that if there's one thing that's going to have to change, it's this whole um, notion of peace before probably anything else, because that's no longer on the table. It's not about a solution to a problem. It's about a reckoning. It's about an acknowledgement. It's about, as you say, intellectual honesty. It's about a lot of words that have lost their meanings. Um, Peace being one of them. So I really, I mean, of course, I agree with your assessment of the Israeli inability to hear this and to either take action or acknowledge or legitimate or whatever. But I don't know if there is a solution other than time. Uh, and again, I'm torn here. I mean, obviously, there's justice to be served, and the Palestinians deserve everything, and they deserve it yesterday. They deserve a chance at life, not self-recognition. I mean, of course, self-recognition, obviously, but they deserve life. They deserve healing. They deserve land. They deserve basic conditions for well-being. The destruction that Israel has wreaked on Gaza is really, I think, unprecedented. And I've had enough of the people who keep saying Dresden and Hiroshima. Neither Dresden nor Hiroshima was demolished by hand systematically in an attempt to make them unlivable. So I think time, time and exposure, time and just being quiet and listening and hearing for the first time in their lives the Palestinian voice that will challenge them twice, not just with regard to stifled and repressed national ambitions, but also where it would hurt Israelis the most, which is as the victims of a genocide. That's something that's almost impossible for Israelis to bear, even now. That's the one word that will freak the great majority of Israeli Jews out, the use of genocide, which, of course, I mean, the world over now accepts the fact that there was a genocide, regardless of whatever the semi-useless international tribunals determine. But Israelis can't bear the notion of a genocide because that would rob them of uh, the sense of uniqueness, which is the root of Israeli impunity or Israeli singularity, if you will. So that's the thing that has to go. This notion of being a singularity, this solipsistic fantasy, this understanding. I've been toying with this notion that a way of explaining what happened to Israel after October 7th is that our id and our superego changed places. And that we are now what we think of as the norms of our society, our nightmares and our submerged fears and everything that is even reminiscent of rules and norms has been pushed downward into the murky depths of our collective psyche. That process has to be reversed, and that cannot happen as a result of some kind of quote unquote solution, because that isn't a problem. It is, as you say, an existential condition, and it can only change through existence. And these are not consoling words, but I think they're true. Our language, really, Hebrew, has to reacquire meaning. Um, Meaning that it has lost, and has lost intentionally. A lot of Israelis said this months after October 7th, 2023. Our hearts have shut down. We have no room in our hearts for empathy for anyone but ourselves. And a lot of them are saying this right now. But time in its most immediate sense, time in the sense of an expiration date, time in a sense of understanding that all traumas, all sacrifices, all experiences of loss must at some point be processed and turned into uh, fodder for growth, a desire to grow. Now, I don't doubt that a political solution, a strategic situation needs to be imposed on Israelis. But the desire to grow can only come from within. And I don't know if it will happen. I can only hope that it will, because I believe it's part of the human condition. And I also believe in our young people. And I've met quite a few of them over the past months. And not just young, I've met very good people, and I'm optimistic, but there are so few of us. It has really made me very sober about the chances of any single solution being sufficient. And I'll just share words of a wise Jubu friend I have, who we had an argument, a WhatsApp argument, with two young people who were all about signing petitions and going out on demonstrations. And he told them very Buddhistically that hope was an illusion. And they really got mad. They said, you talk like a machine. And what can we do if we don't have hope? We have to have hope. We have to try and change things. The conversation ended, and then he and I continued to chat privately. And he said, I made a mistake, Ori. I told them that hope was an illusion, but I forgot the other part, the other side, which is that despair is an illusion as well. We don't have hope to define everything for us, but with the exact same imperative prevents us from defining everything by despair. We have life, and we need to live life. And that's not philosophical at all. It's very, very practical. Israeli Jews have to understand that their lives are intertwined with the lives of Palestinians, and they have to accept the humanity and the existence and the livelihood of those Palestinians. And that can only happen with time and through forced exposure. And that might stir up T.S. Eliot's dry land and create a desire for growth.